Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This isn't the scariest story I've ever heard, and to be honest, I'm still a skeptic. I don't know whether that's because I genuinely don't believe in paranormal things, or because I always try to find a logical explanation for everything. Even after this experience, I still consider myself skeptical. But it remains one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me. And to this day, I can't fully explain it. This happened back in 2017 when I was 17 years old and still in high school. At the time, I had a friend who was in an unusual category of friendship. We got along really well and were comfortable around each other, but we weren't the kind of friends who hung out alone very often. We shared the same best friend, and most of the time, if we were together, it was because all three of us were hanging out as a group. We liked each other, but we weren't especially close. One weekend, my best friend and I decided to go over to his house. It was my first time ever visiting, but she had been there countless times before. The entire drive there, she kept talking about how amazing his house was. "You'll love it," she said. "It's one of the coolest houses I've ever been in." Naturally, my curiosity grew. Our town was fairly small, surrounded by mountains and open countryside. To reach his house, we had to drive a little outside town and head toward the base of the mountains that seemed to wrap around and protect the area. The farther we drove, the fewer houses we saw. Eventually, we turned onto a long dirt road. The road stretched ahead of us for what felt like forever. Trees lined parts of it, while open land surrounded the rest. It wasn't creepy or isolated in a horror movie kind of way, but it definitely felt separate from the rest of town. At the end of the road sat the house. The first thing I noticed was how large it was. It wasn't a creepy mansion or a rundown farmhouse. In fact, it looked surprisingly modern. The architecture made me think it had probably been built sometime in the 1990s, or maybe renovated heavily since then. Everything looked clean, updated, and well-maintained. The property was beautiful. The house looked expensive without feeling overly flashy. It had the kind of appearance that immediately made you think the family was doing well financially. At the same time, it felt warm and inviting. There was nothing intimidating about it. Nothing that suggested it held any kind of dark history. If anything, it looked like the perfect family home. We walked inside, and my first impression only reinforced that feeling. The house felt lived in. There were family photos, comfortable furniture, decorations that reflected years of memories. It felt welcoming. The atmosphere was pleasant and relaxed. We spent the first several minutes laughing, joking, and talking while our friend gave us a tour. Every room seemed normal. The kitchen was beautiful. The living room was spacious. Everything felt exactly as you'd expect from a nice family home. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt strange. Then we reached the part of the house where his room was located. The layout was unique. Instead of simply having a bedroom down a hallway like most houses, he had what almost felt like his own private section of the home. To get there, you had to open a separate door. Once you stepped through it, you entered a large room that served as both a library and a second living room. Bookshelves lined the walls. There were comfortable chairs and couches scattered around. It was quiet and cozy. Directly ahead was a staircase leading upstairs. At the top of those stairs was his bedroom. The entire section felt almost like a separate apartment connected to the rest of the house. As soon as he opened the door and we stepped into that area, something happened. To this day, I remember the feeling with incredible clarity. 1 second I was completely fine. The next second, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. Nothing physically happened. But the instant I crossed that threshold, a wave of emotion hit me. My mood dropped. Completely, it felt like someone had flipped a switch inside my head. The happiness I had been feeling moments earlier disappeared. Instead, I was overwhelmed by a deep sense of sadness. Not ordinary sadness. Not the kind of sadness that comes from hearing bad news. This felt heavier, older, almost suffocating. I suddenly felt uncomfortable. Not scared exactly. Just deeply unsettled. Like there was something wrong with that section of the house. I tried ignoring it. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my mood had simply shifted. Maybe I was overthinking. But the feeling refused to go away. As we continued the tour, I became quieter and quieter. My friend kept talking and showing us around. My best friend kept laughing and joking. But I found myself falling silent. The sadness grew stronger. I couldn't explain it. It felt as though the air itself had changed, as though I had walked into a place carrying a weight I couldn't see. Eventually, my best friend noticed. She knew me well enough to immediately recognize when something was off. She kept glancing at me. "Are you okay?" she asked. I shrugged. Yeah, but she could tell I wasn't. Several times she asked again. Each time I gave short answers. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling because it sounded ridiculous even to me. Eventually, we ended up hanging out in our friend's bedroom upstairs. The strange feeling still hadn't gone away. Everyone else was talking normally while I sat quietly. Finally, our friend looked at me. "Seriously, what's wrong?" he asked. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to say anything. I knew how weird it would sound. But eventually the words came out. "I don't know," I said. "I just feel like something really bad happened here." The room went quiet. I continued speaking. "It feels sad, really sad. Like something awful happened in this part of the house specifically." Neither of them laughed. Neither of them interrupted me. They simply stared. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then my friend slowly sat back. His expression had changed completely. The casual, relaxed attitude he'd had all afternoon was gone. "What do you mean?" he asked. I struggled to explain. "I don't know, I just feel it. The rest of the house feels normal. But this area feels different." He looked at me for a long moment before finally speaking. What he said next completely caught me off guard. According to him, the property had a tragic history. Long before his family owned it, a man had built the house for himself and his wife. The man was a doctor. His wife stayed home. They were deeply in love but never had children. Then tragedy struck. While they were still relatively young, somewhere in their 30s, the wife developed cancer. Despite being a doctor, her husband couldn't save her. He watched her condition worsen. He watched her suffer. And eventually, she died. According to the story, her death completely destroyed him. The grief consumed him. He became depressed and isolated. Unable to cope with losing the person he loved most, he eventually took his own life with a shotgun. The worst part was that nobody found him for nearly a week. As he told the story, I felt chills run through my body. Then came the detail that really disturbed me. The woman had died in the area where his bedroom now stood, and the man had ended his life in the library directly beneath it. The exact section of the house where I had suddenly felt overwhelmed by sadness. I sat there speechless. My best friend looked just as surprised. She had visited that house countless times and had never heard the story. Our friend explained that he rarely told anyone. In fact, he admitted he hadn't even told our shared best friend because he worried people would stop coming over if they knew. What shocked him wasn't the fact that I found the story creepy. It was the fact that I brought up feeling something before he had ever told me any of it. Years later, he admitted that my reaction genuinely scared him, not because he believed in ghosts, but because there had been no obvious reason for me to suddenly become emotional the moment I entered that part of the house. The strange thing is that this wasn't the only time something like that had happened to me. Even as a child, there were certain places in my hometown that made me uncomfortable. Not because they looked scary, not because I knew anything about them, just because they felt wrong. Sometimes I would pass a house and feel uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. Other times I would refuse to go near certain properties because they gave me an overwhelming sense of dread. As I got older, I started asking questions. Whenever one of those houses came back to mind, I would ask my parents if they knew anything about it. More often than not, the answers surprised me. One house where I always felt uncomfortable had been the site of a murder decades earlier. Another was where an elderly woman had suffered a tragic accident and died. Yet another had its own disturbing history that I had never known about as a child. Of course, none of that proves anything supernatural. Not even close. There are countless possible explanations. Maybe I subconsciously noticed details that hinted at something being wrong. Maybe I picked up on stories I'd heard without realizing it. Maybe coincidence played a role. Maybe human intuition is simply stronger than we realize. I honestly don't know. Even now, years later, I remain skeptical. I don't automatically believe in ghosts, spirits, or paranormal explanations. I still look for facts. I still prefer evidence over assumptions. But at the same time, I can't completely ignore experiences like this. The feeling I had in that house was real. The sadness was real. And the timing was impossible to ignore. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something science simply hasn't fully explained yet. I don't claim to know the answer. All I know is that the moment I stepped into that section of the house, I felt a grief that wasn't mine. And when I later learned what had happened there, it became one of the few experiences in my life that left me questioning whether there might be more to our world than we fully understand. I've been milking this story ever since it happened. Honestly, it's become my go-to icebreaker whenever people start sharing creepy experiences. Most people think I'm exaggerating until I tell them the whole thing. This happened during the summer holidays when I was still pretty young. My parents were out somewhere that evening. To this day, I honestly have no idea where they were. All I knew was that I had the house to myself. As any responsible child would do when left unsupervised, I had completely taken over the kitchen. I was sitting there watching Minecraft videos for hours. I had a microwave meal sitting next to me and a massive bag of crisps that I was slowly working my way through. Looking back, it was pretty much the perfect night. No parents. No responsibilities, just YouTube and junk food. I don't remember the exact time, but it was definitely late. Probably somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. The whole house was quiet, except for the sound of whatever Minecraft video I was completely obsessed with at the time. Then, I heard a knock at the front door. At first, I barely reacted. The strange thing was that nobody ever knocked on our door. Our house had an incredibly loud doorbell mounted right next to the entrance. If someone wanted to get our attention, they rang the bell. That's what everyone did. My parents certainly did. In fact, I can't remember them ever knocking on the door. They either used the doorbell or simply unlocked the door and walked inside. So when I heard the knock, I just assumed it was some random person. Back then we used to get plenty of cold callers and people trying to sell things. I figured it was probably one of them, so I ignored it. A few moments later, there was another knock. This time I glanced toward the hallway, but still didn't think much about it. I was far more interested in whatever was happening in the video. Then came a third knock. Only this one was different. The knocking started, then suddenly stopped halfway through, as if whoever was doing it had been interrupted, or distracted, or changed their mind. At the time, I still didn't react. I simply continued watching videos. Then, about a minute later, something changed. It's hard to explain. Nothing happened. I didn't hear another sound. I didn't see anyone. Yet suddenly I felt this overwhelming wave of paranoia. The feeling hit me instantly, like a switch had been flipped somewhere in my brain. Every hair on my body stood up. I felt watched, not suspicious, not nervous. Watched. The strange part is that there was absolutely no reason for me to feel that way. Yet my body reacted before my mind could catch up. And then it dawned on me, the layout of the house. My kitchen sat directly beside the front door. If somebody walked up to knock on the door, they could very easily move around the front of the house and look directly into the kitchen window. Directly at me. The realization made my stomach drop. Suddenly, the entire situation felt different. I muted the video. The house became silent. I sat perfectly still, listening, waiting, trying to hear something. Anything. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt louder than the television had been. I remember sitting there frozen for what was probably only 30 seconds. It felt much longer. Eventually, I decided I needed to leave the kitchen. I wasn't planning to investigate. I wasn't planning to look outside. I just wanted to get away from the window. Slowly, I stood up, trying not to make any noise. Then I turned toward the doorway. As I began walking out of the kitchen, I looked toward the window, and that's when I saw him. A face. Someone was looking inside. I only got a brief glimpse, but I clearly remember one thing. The person had no hair. Whether they were bald or shaved their head, I don't know. But seeing an unfamiliar face staring through the window at me in the middle of the night instantly sent every survival instinct I had into overdrive. I stopped moving immediately. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply froze. The fear was so intense that it almost felt unreal. I backed into the doorway and stood there. Then I heard another sound. The letterbox. Someone was touching it, moving it, lifting it up and letting it fall. At first I hoped maybe I was imagining it. Then I heard it again. The metallic sound was unmistakable. Whoever was outside was messing with our letterbox. Then came the moment that still freaks me out years later. A voice. Clear as day. Coming through the letterbox. "Let me in, little boy." I wish I could tell you that I shouted back, or called the police, or did something brave. I didn't. I stood there completely motionless. Every part of my body felt frozen. The voice sounded calm, almost casual, which somehow made it even worse. There was no anger, no shouting, just those words. "Let me in, little boy." I knew immediately that this wasn't some misunderstanding. This wasn't a lost person asking for help. This wasn't a neighbor. Something was very wrong. So I stayed silent, completely silent. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The house felt enormous and empty. Every second seemed to stretch forever. I kept expecting another knock, another voice, the sound of a window opening, anything. Instead, there was mostly silence. I remained standing there for what felt like an eternity. Realistically, it was probably close to an entire hour spent listening, waiting, hoping whoever had been outside would leave. Eventually, I managed to gather enough courage to move. Very slowly, I retrieved my phone. My hands were shaking. I contacted my parents immediately and told them what had happened. Thankfully, they took it seriously. They came home around 20 minutes later. By then, whoever had been outside was gone. We checked around the house. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No explanation. Just an empty street. Looking back now, the thing that scares me most isn't what happened. It's what almost happened. Whenever people tell stories like this, they always think about the what-ifs, the possibilities, the tiny decisions that change everything. And this story has one massive what-if. What if that person had rung the doorbell instead of knocking? That sounds ridiculous, but it's true. I was young. I couldn't properly see through the peephole. My parents were expected home that night. If I had heard the doorbell ring, I probably would have assumed it was them. I probably would have walked right up to the door. And I probably would have opened it without thinking twice. That realization still gives me chills. Because whatever that person wanted, they clearly knew I was inside. They watched me through the window. They spoke through the letterbox, and for reasons I'll never understand, they wanted me to open that door. Thankfully, I didn't. And even though years have passed since that night, I still occasionally think about the bald stranger staring through my kitchen window and wonder what would have happened if I'd made a different choice. Growing up, I always believed in ghosts and spirits. In my family, those kinds of stories were treated seriously, not like jokes or made-up tales to scare children. My nan and great-nan both claimed they could see spirits throughout their lives, and because of that, I grew up believing there were things in this world that could not always be explained. Some families passed down traditions or recipes, but in my family, strange stories and paranormal experiences were passed down almost like normal conversations. As a child, I became completely fascinated with spooky things. I loved ghost stories, haunted houses, creepy documentaries, and anything mysterious. While most kids were scared of horror movies, I was drawn to them. I think part of that came from hearing my nan talk about the spirits she supposedly saw. She would describe shadows standing in hallways, figures watching from corners, or strange feelings in empty rooms. The adults around me spoke about these things so casually that it made the paranormal feel real long before I was old enough to fully understand fear. At the same time, though, believing in ghosts also made me more aware of darkness and strange noises than most children my age. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow on the wall, and every unexplained sound immediately caught my attention. One experience in particular stayed with me my entire life. I was around 5 years old when it first happened. At the time, we were living in a small house that I barely remember clearly now except for my bedroom. I can still picture certain parts of that room perfectly even years later. My bed sat against one wall near the window, and across from it was a dark corner that never seemed fully lit, even during the daytime. One night, I was lying awake in bed, unable to sleep. The house was completely quiet. My parents had already gone to bed, and there were no sounds except the occasional creaking noise old houses sometimes make at night. I remember staring into the darkness while trying to fall asleep when suddenly I heard something very clearly. A footstep. Not a loud stomp. Just one slow, heavy step. At first, I thought maybe one of my parents had walked past my room. But the sound felt wrong somehow, because it seemed like it came from inside the room itself, not outside in the hallway. The second I heard it, my entire body became tense. I slowly looked around my bedroom, trying to figure out where the noise came from. That was when I saw it. Standing in the corner of my room was the shadow of a man. Even now, after all these years, I still remember exactly how terrifying that moment felt. The figure itself was dark, almost darker than the rest of the room somehow. It looked tall and motionless, standing perfectly still in the corner while facing toward me. At 5 years old, I froze completely. I remember pulling the blanket up tightly while staring at the figure, too scared to even scream at first. My heart was beating so fast that I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct inside me told me not to look away from it. The strangest part was that it did not move. It simply stood there silently. No face. No clear details. Just the shape of a man made entirely from shadow. Eventually, I squeezed my eyes shut and buried myself under the blanket because I was too terrified to keep looking. I stayed like that for what felt like forever before finally falling asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I told my family about it. Instead of dismissing me completely, my nan became strangely serious. She asked me where I saw the figure standing and whether it spoke or moved. At the time, her reaction actually scared me more because it made me feel like maybe what I saw had been real. As the years passed, we moved houses several times. At first, I assumed the experience was just a childhood nightmare, or my imagination playing tricks on me. Lots of children are afraid of dark corners and shadows. That explanation made sense to me. But then something started happening that I still cannot fully explain. No matter where we moved, I kept seeing the same shadow. Not every night. Not constantly. But enough times that it stayed in my mind. Every new bedroom seemed fine at first. Then one night I would wake up or glance toward a dark corner and suddenly feel that same fear all over again. And there it would be. The same shadowy figure standing silently in the corner of the room. It never rushed toward me, never spoke, never moved aggressively. It simply watched. That honestly made it feel even more unsettling somehow. If it had acted dramatically, maybe my brain could have processed it as a nightmare more easily. But the stillness of it always disturbed me deeply. As I got older, I started questioning myself more. Part of me wondered if my lifelong belief in ghosts caused my imagination to create these experiences. When children grow up hearing paranormal stories constantly, their minds can become highly sensitive to shadows and fear. I understand that logically now. But another part of me still remembers how real those moments felt. Especially because the figure always looked the same, no matter the house, no matter the room. Always standing in a corner, always silent. Sometimes months or even years would pass without me seeing it. Then one random night, usually when I was alone or half asleep, I would glance toward a dark area of the room and suddenly feel that familiar fear creeping back into my chest. The older I became, the more I tried ignoring it. I stopped telling people because I knew how unbelievable it sounded. Most people immediately assume things like this are sleep paralysis, imagination, or anxiety. And honestly, maybe they are right. But there are moments that still disturb me. Sometimes I would see the figure for only a second before it disappeared. Other times I would stare directly at the corner, trying to convince myself it was just clothes, shadows, or poor lighting. Yet the fear never fully went away. The worst part was the feeling that came with seeing it. It was not normal fear. It felt heavy. Cold, like the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed the moment I noticed the figure standing there. Even now, as an adult, I still feel uneasy sleeping in completely dark rooms. I usually need some kind of light nearby because dark corners still make me uncomfortable. Every once in a while, I will wake up during the middle of the night and instinctively look toward the corner of the room before I even realize I am doing it. Part of me expects to see that shadow standing there again. What makes the whole thing stranger is how consistent the image remained throughout my life. Human imagination usually changes details over time, especially from childhood memories. But this figure always felt exactly the same to me. Tall, silent, watching from the corner. I sometimes wonder if my mind attached itself to that first childhood experience so strongly that it became a permanent fear I carried into every new home. Maybe once my brain associated dark corners with danger at 5 years old, it continued repeating the pattern throughout my life. That explanation probably makes the most sense logically, but late at night, when the room is quiet and shadows stretch across the walls, logic does not always help. Because deep down, a small part of me still remembers the feeling of hearing that single footstep when I was 5 years old, and the fear of looking up to see a shadow standing silently in the corner of my room. When I was 17, my friend and I had an experience that completely changed the way we looked at the world. Even now, years later, I still think about that night more often than I want to admit. I am 21 now, and despite getting older and trying to think logically about it, I still cannot fully explain what happened. I know how crazy the story sounds, and honestly, if someone else told me this exact thing, I would probably struggle to believe it too. But I swear on everything that what happened that night felt completely real. Back then, my friend and I spent almost every evening together. We lived in a small area where there was not much for teenagers to do, so we made our own little place to hang out. Hidden behind some overgrown bushes and thick plants near an old abandoned structure, we had what we called our shelter. It was not really a proper shelter, just an old hidden spot where we could sit, smoke, drink occasionally, and talk without adults bothering us. To us, it felt like our own secret place. We spent countless nights there laughing, listening to music, telling stories, and talking about life. During the daytime, the area looked harmless enough, but at night, it became completely different. The bushes surrounding the place were tall and dense, and the darkness between them felt almost endless once the sun. Still, we were teenagers, and fear was not something we thought much about back then. One night, we had been returning from church pretty late. I remember the streets being unusually quiet. There were almost no cars passing by, and the air felt cold and damp. My friend and I were walking casually toward our shelter, talking about random things the way we always did. As we got closer to the area surrounded by bushes, something immediately felt strange. At first, it was just a sound. Laughter, coming from inside the bushes. We stopped walking almost instantly. The laughter sounded familiar enough that neither of us panicked at first. In fact, we both assumed it was some younger kids from the neighborhood messing around. There were a few boys around 12 or 13 years old who lived nearby, and they occasionally tried following us around because they thought we were cool older teenagers. So initially, we thought it was them hiding in the bushes trying to scare us. But then we realized something strange. The voices were not speaking actual words. They were only one voice would laugh for a few seconds, then another voice would start, then another. It kept switching between different voices one at a time, almost unnaturally, like something was copying them instead of having a normal conversation. There were 3 voices in total. Even now, I can still remember how wrong the laughter sounded. It was not it felt forced somehow, almost like someone trying to imitate human behavior without fully understanding it. My friend and I looked at each other nervously. At that point, I still thought it had to be the younger boys playing some weird prank. Trying to act confident, I pulled out my flashlight and pointed it toward the bushes. I remember speaking loudly and telling them to stop hiding and come out so we could talk to them properly. The laughter stopped instantly. Everything went silent. Not normal silence either. The kind of silence where it suddenly feels like the entire world around you is holding its breath. Then, something moved inside the bushes. Before I could fully process what was happening, a creature suddenly jumped out. The terrifying part is that I did not actually see it clearly myself because it happened too fast and slightly outside the direction my flashlight was pointing. But my friend saw it directly. And whatever he saw completely changed him. The thing burst out from the bushes with unbelievable speed and ran toward the broken structure nearby. I only caught movement and heard the sound of something heavy hitting the ground as it ran. My friend, however, froze completely. I remember him making this choking sound like he could not even breathe properly. The creature leaped through a broken window opening and disappeared into the darkness beyond the structure within seconds. Then, everything became quiet again. For a moment, neither of us moved. I turned toward my friend and immediately saw pure terror on his face. I had never seen him look like that before. He was pale, shaking, and staring toward the broken window like he had just witnessed something impossible. I kept asking him what he saw. At first, he could barely speak. Eventually, he described it. He said the creature had massive legs covered in black hair. The legs looked unnaturally long and bent in a way that reminded him of a goat or some kind of animal. He said that was the clearest thing he saw because it moved so fast, but the shape itself looked wrong. Not human, not fully animal, but something in between. The way he described it honestly made my blood run cold. We left immediately after that. Neither of us wanted to stay there another second. The walk home felt completely different from normal. Every shadow suddenly looked threatening, and every sound made us jump. My friend barely spoke the entire time. Over the following days, I noticed something had seriously changed in him. At first, we both tried making logical explanations. Maybe it was a large animal. Maybe fear distorted what he saw in the darkness. Maybe our minds exaggerated the experience because we got startled. But deep down, neither of us really believed those explanations. Especially my friend. He started having nightmares almost immediately after that night. At first, he brushed it off and laughed about it awkwardly. But the nightmares kept happening over and over again. Sometimes he would wake up sweating and unable to sleep afterward. Other times he claimed he dreamed about hearing the same laughter outside his house late at night. The worst part was how long it lasted. Not days. Not weeks. Years. For almost 4 years straight, he dealt with nightmares connected to that thing. Even now, he still gets uncomfortable talking about it. Whenever the subject comes up, I can see the fear return to his face instantly. As for me, I tried forcing myself to move on. For a long time, I convinced myself that maybe we had simply scared each other. The human brain can do strange things in darkness, especially when fear gets involved. I kept telling myself that, but then something happened recently that brought all the fear back. I had another interaction. Not exactly the same as before, but close enough that it made my stomach drop the moment it happened. I do not even fully know how to explain it properly because it sounds insane when spoken out loud. But I heard something near that same area again. Not animals. Voices. And the second I heard them, I immediately remembered that night from years earlier. The feeling that hit me was instant and overwhelming. It felt like all the fear I buried for years suddenly came rushing back at once. I left the area immediately because every instinct inside me told me not to stay. Since then, I have been unable to stop thinking. That is honestly why I am sharing this story now. I want to know if anyone else has experienced something similar, because this feels far too real to simply ignore. I know people online love making jokes about paranormal stories or creatures in the woods, but this genuinely affected both of us deeply. I am 21 years old, yet I still feel unsettled thinking about something I encountered 4 or 5 years ago. And the weirdest part is not even the creature itself. It is the voices. That fake laughter. The way it copied people we knew. That part still disturbs me more than anything else, because it felt intelligent in a way that ordinary animals aren't. It felt like something trying to lure us closer or confuse us. Maybe there is some explanation we simply do not understand. Maybe fear and darkness distorted everything. Or maybe there really are things out there that people occasionally encounter but cannot explain. All I know is that something was hiding in those bushes that night. Something that was not normal, and even years later, I still cannot shake the feeling that whatever it was, knew we were there long before we noticed it. I've always been fascinated by creepy stories. But the truth is that some of the scariest experiences I've ever had happened to me personally. None of them involve seeing monsters or ghosts standing at the end of my bed. They're the kind of experiences that leave you with questions instead of answers. Maybe there are logical explanations for all of them. Maybe there aren't. Either way, they're moments that have stayed with me for years. The first story happened when I was around 10 years old. At the time, both of my parents worked night shifts. It wasn't unusual for them to be gone during the evening, leaving me and my brother home alone for several hours. We were used to it, and most nights were completely normal. Our house wasn't particularly old, and nothing strange had ever happened there before. It was just a regular family home. One night, I was sitting in the living room using the family computer. Back then, I spent most of my free time playing games online, watching videos, or talking to friends. The computer desk was positioned in a corner of the room, right beside a large window that overlooked our backyard. During the day, the view wasn't anything special. It was just a normal backyard with a fence around it. But at night, everything outside became a wall of darkness. You could barely see anything beyond the glass. My brother was in his room doing his own thing while I sat at the computer. I was wearing headphones, completely focused on whatever I was doing. The house was quiet. Everything felt normal. Then, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. At first, I thought I had imagined it. The sound was strange because I was wearing headphones, and whatever I was listening to should have drowned out most of the noise around me. I paused what I was doing and listened. For a moment, there was silence. Then it happened again. 3 sharp knocks. This time, I knew I had heard it correctly. The sound had come from the window directly beside me. The exact window that looked out into the backyard. Every hair on my body stood up. I slowly turned my head toward the glass. The darkness outside made it impossible to see anything clearly. I remember staring for a second, trying to make out a shape or movement beyond the window. Nothing. Just darkness. The fact that I couldn't see anyone somehow made it worse. If there had been a person standing there, at least I would have known what caused the noise. Instead, there was only empty blackness staring back at me. Then, I started thinking. Who would be in our backyard at night? The gate was always locked. Our fence wasn't easy to climb. And most importantly, my parents weren't home. The realization hit me all at once. Someone had just knocked on a window knowing there were children inside. I didn't stick around to investigate. The second the fear fully kicked in, I jumped out of my chair and ran. I don't think my feet even touched half the floor between the living room and my brother's bedroom. I practically burst through his door. He immediately knew something was wrong because I was completely panicked. After that, neither of us wanted to go near the living room for the rest of the night. Even now, years later, I still wonder who or what was standing outside that window. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was someone passing through the yard. Maybe it was an animal somehow making a strange noise. But in that moment, it sounded exactly like somebody intentionally knocking on the glass. And that's a memory I haven't forgotten. The second story happened about a year ago. By then I was much older and far less likely to be scared by every little sound. Or at least that's what I thought. One evening, I was once again sitting in the same living room where the first incident had happened. It's funny how certain rooms seem to collect strange memories over the years. The house was quiet. I was relaxing on the couch, scrolling through my phone and enjoying a peaceful evening. There wasn't anyone moving around upstairs. There wasn't a television playing loudly. There wasn't any construction happening outside. Everything was calm. Then I heard a noise directly above me. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I ignored it. Houses make noises all the time. Wood expands and contracts. Pipes shift. Roofs creak. There are plenty of normal explanations. But the sound continued. It wasn't random. It wasn't a single creak. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps. Slow footsteps moving through the attic space directly above where I was sitting. I remember freezing and looking toward the ceiling. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps seemed to move from one side of the attic to the other. I tried convincing myself it was something harmless. Maybe a squirrel, maybe a bird on the roof, maybe the house settling. But deep down, I knew why I felt uncomfortable. The sounds didn't seem random. They sounded controlled, measured, intentional, as though someone was walking carefully through the attic. I sat there listening for several minutes. The more I listened, the more nervous I became. Eventually, I gave up trying to rationalize it. I turned off the lights, went upstairs, and spent the rest of the evening in my room. That night, I don't think I've ever prayed harder before falling asleep. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving around directly above my head. The final story happened only a few days ago. And honestly, it might be the creepiest of them all. I was spending the evening at my best friend's house. We weren't doing anything exciting, just hanging out, talking, smoking, and relaxing like we usually did. It was one of those quiet nights where time passes without you really noticing. My friend and I were sitting in her room laughing about random things when suddenly we heard a sound from above us, a footstep. Then another, then another. We both immediately stopped talking. The room fell silent. We looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded. The sound had come from the attic, and it definitely sounded like footsteps. Not scratching, not creaking, not something falling. Footsteps, someone or something moving around directly above us. At first we tried laughing it off. But then the sounds continued. Slow footsteps crossing the attic floor. Back and forth. Back and forth. The strange thing was that everyone in the house was accounted for. Her mom was downstairs. Her dad was downstairs. Her sister was downstairs. Her older brother was in the room next to us. Her younger brother wasn't even home. There shouldn't have been anyone in the attic at all. Yet the footsteps continued. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The relaxed mood disappeared. Neither of us felt like joking anymore. We just listened. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The footsteps would stop for a moment, and then start again. Each time they returned, my stomach tightened. Eventually, my friend reminded me of something that made the situation even more unsettling. A lot of members of her family had passed away in that house over the years. The home had been in the family for a long time. Multiple relatives had lived there. Multiple relatives had died there. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, that's the kind of information that immediately changes the way you think about strange noises. Then she told me a story I'd never heard before. Before her family lived in the house, one of her relatives, her aunt, had experienced something bizarre. According to the story, her aunt had been sleeping in the very same room we were sitting in. Everything had been normal. Then sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, she was suddenly awakened by music. A radio in the room had turned on by itself. Not static, not random noise. Music, and according to her aunt, the song playing was Ave Maria. The radio wasn't supposed to be on. Nobody had touched it. Yet in the middle of the night, it suddenly came to life on its own. As my friend finished telling me that story, another set of footsteps crossed the attic above us. At that point, neither of us were laughing anymore. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe old houses simply make strange noises. Maybe there was an animal in the attic. Maybe the radio story had a completely normal explanation too. But sitting there in that room, listening to footsteps moving around directly above our heads while hearing stories about relatives who had passed away in the same house, it was impossible not to feel uneasy. Eventually the sounds stopped. Nothing else happened that night. No voices, no apparitions, no shadows moving through the room. Just silence. But sometimes silence can be scarier than anything else, because it leaves your imagination free to fill in the blanks. To this day, I don't know what caused any of those experiences. The knocking at the window, the footsteps in my attic, the footsteps in my friend's attic. Maybe they were all completely explainable. Maybe they weren't. All I know is that every time I hear an unexplained noise late at night, my mind immediately goes back to those moments. And no matter how hard I try to act brave, there's always a small part of me that wonders what might be standing just outside the window, or walking quietly above my head in the darkness. This happened when I was 14 years old. I'm 15 now, and even though it only happened about a year ago, I still think about it all the time. Whenever the memory comes back, I get the same feeling of fear that I felt that night. Even now, I'm not completely sure what happened. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that it felt incredibly real. The day itself had been completely normal. Nothing particularly bad happened. I went about my usual routine, did normal things, and spent most of the day like any other teenager would. However, looking back on it now, there was something strange about the way I felt. I can't really explain it properly. The entire day seemed slightly off somehow. Not in a dramatic way, just enough that I noticed it. I spent most of the day daydreaming. I've always had a very active imagination. Ever since I was little, I've been able to create detailed scenarios in my head. Sometimes I imagine conversations that never happened. Other times, I create entire stories and situations just for fun. It's something I've always done naturally. That day, however, it felt like I was doing it more than usual. My mind constantly drifted away from reality. I would be doing one thing and suddenly find myself lost in another imaginary scenario. Hours passed like that. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I just assumed I was having one of those days where my imagination was working overtime. Eventually, evening arrived. Everything still seemed normal. I had dinner, got ready for bed, and went into my room. I remember feeling tired, not exhausted, but ready to sleep. I climbed into bed and got comfortable beneath my blanket. The room was mostly dark except for a little bit of light coming through my window. I was preparing to close my eyes and fall asleep. Then, I noticed something. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Sitting on the chair in my room was a figure, a completely black figure. I immediately focused on it. The shape was impossible to miss. It wasn't a shadow cast by furniture. It wasn't clothing draped over the chair. It looked like something was actually sitting or standing there. The figure appeared darker than the darkness around it. Its entire body was black. No details. No visible clothing, just a solid black shape. But there was one thing I could see clearly. Its eyes. They were bright red, not glowing like a flashlight, just intensely red, and they were staring directly at me. I froze. For a moment, I honestly thought I was daydreaming again. Because of my imagination, I sometimes picture things in my head very vividly. I assumed this was another one of those moments. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my brain was creating an image. Maybe I wasn't fully awake. So I tried to ignore it. I looked away. I imagined other things. I deliberately focused on different thoughts. But when I looked back, it was still there, watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut. For several seconds, I kept them closed. Then I opened them again. The figure hadn't moved. It was still standing on the chair, still staring directly at me. My stomach dropped. That's when real fear started setting in. The thing didn't resemble any person I had ever seen before. It had wild, messy hair sticking up from its head. Its fingers were unusually long, far too long to look normal. Everything about its appearance felt wrong. It looked like something that shouldn't exist. The worst part wasn't how it looked. The worst part was that it wasn't doing anything. It simply stood there, watching, silent, motionless. Its red eyes never seemed to leave mine. The longer I stared at it, the more terrified I became. I wanted to move. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out of the room. But suddenly, I couldn't. My body felt completely frozen. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move a muscle. I couldn't even call for help. My voice wouldn't come out. It felt like all control had been taken away from me. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat. It was pounding so hard that it felt like it was shaking my entire body. My chest hurt. My breathing became fast and shallow. At one point, I genuinely thought I might die. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's honestly how scared I was. My heart was racing so fast that I wondered if I was having some kind of medical emergency. Every terrifying possibility raced through my mind. Was I imagining it? Was I dreaming? Was I awake? Was this thing real? Was it going to hurt me? Was I about to die? The questions kept piling up, and the figure continued staring. I could feel tears forming in my eyes. I wasn't crying loudly. I wasn't sobbing. I was too focused on the thing in front of me. My entire attention was locked onto it. The fear was overwhelming. At some point, my body started shaking, not from cold, from pure terror. I've never experienced fear like that before or since. The room felt smaller, the darkness felt heavier, and those red eyes never seemed to blink. Time completely lost meaning. A few seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. It was impossible to tell how long I sat there frozen. Then something changed. The figure moved, only slightly, but it moved. I watched as it slowly leaned forward, just a little. Then it returned to its original position. The movement was small, but it was enough. The moment it moved, every excuse I had been giving myself vanished. If it was my imagination, why was it moving? If it was a shadow, how could it move? My panic exploded. I was convinced something horrible was about to happen. The figure continued staring, and I continued staring back. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. The silence was unbearable. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe a few minutes, maybe less. To me, it felt like eternity. Every second stretched endlessly. Then, suddenly, something changed. The paralysis disappeared. Without warning, I could move again. The moment control returned to my body, I reacted instantly. I turned around as fast as I could. I don't even remember deciding to do it. It was pure instinct. For a split second, I looked away. Then, I immediately looked back toward the chair. The figure was gone. Completely gone. The chair was empty. Nothing stood there. Nothing moved. Nothing remained. The room looked exactly as it always had. I stared at the empty chair in disbelief. Part of me expected the figure to reappear. Part of me thought it might be hiding somewhere else in the room. But there was nothing. The fear that had been building inside me finally burst. I jumped out of bed and ran. I don't think I've ever moved faster in my life. I sprinted out of my room crying. By that point, I wasn't just scared. I was terrified. I ran through the house looking for my mother. When I found her, I was crying so hard that I could barely explain what had happened. I told her everything. The figure. The red eyes. The chair. The way I couldn't move. The way it stared at me. The way it disappeared. I expected her to be shocked. Maybe even scared. Instead, she listened calmly. Then she told me that I had imagined it. She said it wasn't real, that I had probably been dreaming or seeing things because I was tired. Part of me wanted to believe her. Honestly, I still do. Because if she was right, then there is a logical explanation. And logical explanations are comforting. But even now, I struggle to accept that completely. The experience felt too real. The fear felt too real. The image remains far too vivid. I can still picture every detail. The black figure, the wild hair, the unnaturally long fingers, and, most of all, those red eyes staring directly into mine. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe it was some strange combination of imagination and exhaustion. Maybe my brain created something while I was caught between being awake and asleep. I don't know. What I do know is that even now, when I think about that night, I can feel my heart start racing again. I can remember the helplessness of being unable to move. I can remember the panic. And I can remember the overwhelming certainty that something was standing in my room watching me. Whatever happened that night, it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. And even though a year has passed, I still sometimes glance toward the chair before going to sleep, just to make sure nothing is standing there, waiting for me in the dark. When I was around 8 years old, I remember hearing one particular story from my family that terrified me so badly I couldn't sleep properly for days afterward. Growing up in a Mexican family, stories about spirits and legends were treated very differently than simple ghost stories people tell for fun. Adults spoke about certain things seriously, almost carefully, like these stories weren't just myths, but warnings passed down through generations. And out of all the legends I heard growing up, none frightened me more than La Llorona. Even as a child, I knew who she was long before this happened. Every kid in my family did. Parents and grandparents would tell stories about hearing a woman crying near rivers, lakes, or empty roads late at night. According to the legend, she was the spirit of a grieving woman searching endlessly for her lost children. Some people treated it like folklore. Others genuinely believed she was real. My older relatives especially never joked about her. That's why what happened to my aunt and uncle stayed with everyone for years afterward. At the time, they lived in Mexico near a large lake outside a smaller rural town. The area was beautiful during the day. Quiet water, trees surrounding the roads, and long stretches of land with very few nearby neighbors. But at night, especially during storms, the entire place became unsettling. The darkness out there felt different somehow. There were no bright streetlights or busy traffic sounds like in cities. Once night came, the only noises were wind, rain, insects, and distant animals. And because the lake sat so close to their home, strange echoes traveled easily through the area. My aunt and uncle had recently become parents back then. Their baby was still very young, only a few months old, and for the first time they had started letting the baby sleep in a separate room beside theirs. According to my aunt, the weather that night had already made everyone uneasy before anything happened. It was around 5 in the morning when the storm became really intense. Heavy rain slammed against the roof and windows, while thunder rolled constantly in the distance. The power flickered a few times throughout the night, leaving the house dim and cold. At some point during the storm, both my aunt and uncle suddenly woke up at almost the exact same time. At first, they didn't fully understand why. Then they heard it. Crying. A woman crying outside. Not normal crying either. The sound was loud enough that it seemed incredibly close to the house despite the heavy rain. According to my uncle, it sounded like deep emotional sobbing mixed with long, painful wails that echoed strangely through the storm. The second they heard it clearly, both of them froze, because they immediately recognized what people in that area always warned about. La Llorona. Even years later, my aunt still swears the sound didn't resemble anything human she had ever heard before. It wasn't simply someone upset outside in the rain. The crying sounded unnatural somehow, stretched out, hollow, and filled with overwhelming grief. The terrifying part was how close it sounded. At first, my aunt thought maybe some woman genuinely needed help nearby, but my uncle reacted completely differently. The moment he heard the crying, he immediately got out of bed and rushed toward the baby's room. He didn't even hesitate. That's how seriously people there took the stories. According to the old legends, La Llorona was often said to target children, especially near water or during storms. Parents in rural areas grew up hearing warnings about never leaving children alone if strange crying was heard at night. My uncle later admitted he felt pure panic the moment he heard it, because the crying seemed close enough to be right outside the house. He grabbed the baby immediately and brought them back into the bedroom with them. The strange thing is that once the baby was inside their room, the crying stopped not long afterward. Completely, no gradual fading, no footsteps leaving, just silence. Only rain remained outside after that. Neither of them slept for the rest of the night. They stayed awake holding the baby while listening carefully to the storm and watching the windows nervously. My aunt said every little sound outside made her jump, because the crying had felt so real and so close only moments earlier. Later that morning, after sunrise finally came and the storm weakened, they talked more calmly about what happened. That's when my uncle brought up something older relatives had always told him growing up. According to the legend, if you hear La Llorona sounding very close to you, she's actually far away. But if you hear her crying far away, then she's close. It sounds backwards and strange, but a lot of people in Mexico grow up hearing that warning. The belief is that her cries intentionally confuse people. So despite how terrified they had been, my uncle tried comforting my aunt afterward by saying the loudness of the crying probably meant whatever they heard wasn't directly near the house after all. Still, neither of them took chances after that. For a long time afterward, the baby slept in their room whenever storms rolled through the area at night. Even now, years later, my family still talks about that night occasionally. Some relatives fully believe they heard La Llorona herself near the lake. Others think maybe the storm distorted sounds from somewhere farther away, and fear filled in the rest. But what makes the story stick with me is how convinced my aunt and uncle both were. Especially my uncle. He wasn't someone who scared easily or believed every ghost story people told. Yet the second he heard that crying outside during the storm, his first instinct was protecting the baby immediately. No hesitation. And honestly, the setting alone makes the story feel terrifying even now when I imagine it. A dark house near a lake. Heavy rain pouring outside before sunrise. A young couple suddenly waking up to the sound of a woman crying somewhere beyond the windows. Then, the silence afterward. Whether people believe in legends or not, stories like that stay with you because they tap into something ancient and unsettling. Fear surrounding motherhood, grief, children, and darkness near water exists in almost every culture somehow. And in many Mexican families, La Llorona isn't treated as just a scary story. She's treated like a warning whispered through generations. To this day, whenever I hear distant crying at night or storms rolling in near lakes or rivers, I always remember that story about my aunt and uncle sitting awake until sunrise holding their baby while listening to rain hit the windows, hoping the crying wouldn't come back. For a little context, I live in the Pacific Northwest and have 2 dogs. One is a Basenji mix named Jubilee, and the other is a Shepherd mix named Pinball. Their personalities couldn't be more different. Pinball is older now. She's reached that stage of life where she'd much rather find a comfortable spot on the floor and spend the day observing the world than run around chasing anything. Sometimes I joke that she's become more rug than dog. She's perfectly happy listening to the sounds around her while barely moving an inch. Jubilee, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. She's a rescue dog with endless energy and curiosity. She wants to be involved in everything at all times. If there's a person, animal, noise, smell, or interesting object nearby, she wants to investigate it immediately. I've lived in the same town for about 5 years. Until recently, my spouse and I were living in an RV on a friend's property. This isn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, but it definitely left me feeling unsettled, and the more I think about it, the stranger it seems. Maybe there's a completely reasonable explanation for everything. In fact, that's what I keep telling myself. But even now, looking back on it, I can't shake the feeling that something was off that day. Earlier this year, we finally moved into a house of our own. Honestly, it felt incredible. After years of temporary living situations, finally having a place that belonged to us felt like a dream come true. The downside was that moving into a house after not having one for so long became an obsession. I spent months working on projects, painting walls, installing trim, building gallery walls, decorating, organizing, reorganizing, finding excuses to reorganize again. Every free moment seemed to disappear into some new home improvement project. As a result, a lot of my usual routines disappeared. One of those routines was hiking and trail walking. My spouse and I used to explore local trails several times a week. The Pacific Northwest is full of them. There are so many trails around here that you could spend years exploring and still find new ones. Because we moved only about 9 minutes away from our previous location, I assumed I already knew most of the nearby trails. I was wrong. Near our new house was an entirely different network of trails that I had never really explored before. I hadn't intentionally avoided them. I just stopped walking regularly while I focused on the house. Recently, though, I finally found some free time and decided it was time to start getting outside again. For additional context, I take medication for panic disorder and bipolar disorder. I mention that because I tend to examine my own thoughts very carefully whenever something strange happens. I usually assume there's a rational explanation before I jump to any conclusions. A few weeks earlier, I had checked out the trail by myself. It was the middle of August. Broad daylight. Nothing unusual happened. Honestly, I found the trail kind of boring. Compared to other trails in the area, it wasn't particularly scenic. There were more people there than I expected, and I left feeling somewhat disappointed. That experience made what happened later even stranger. Today, I decided to take Jubilee with me for a walk. Pinball was heartbroken. The second she realized she wasn't coming, she looked personally betrayed. But sometimes I simply don't have enough energy to handle both dogs at once. Jubilee practically exploded with excitement the moment she realized she was going. The weather was perfect. Classic Pacific Northwest weather. The sky was overcast. The ground was damp from recent rain. Wet leaves covered parts of the trail. The air carried that earthy smell that seems unique to forests in this region. Everything felt peaceful. I was wearing a beanie, trail shoes, and a puffy vest, feeling like the most stereotypical Pacific Northwest resident imaginable. The walk started beautifully. Jubilee was happy. I was happy. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely relaxed. What surprised me was how empty the trail seemed. Normally, that wouldn't have stood out, but it was around 2:30 on a Friday afternoon. Around here, that's prime dog walking time. There are plenty of retirees in town who spend their afternoons exploring trails with their dogs. I expected to pass at least a handful of people. Instead, the trail was almost completely deserted. At first, I enjoyed it. The silence felt nice. The forest seemed calm. Jubilee and I continued deeper along the path. My goal was simply to reach the crossroads where two trail sections intersected. That was as far as I had explored before. When we reached it, I considered turning around. I had pumpkins waiting at home. My spouse and I planned to carve them later that evening. Part of me felt guilty looking at Jubilee and ending the walk so soon. She was having such a great time. So I lingered for a bit before finally deciding to head back. That's when things started feeling strange. Jubilee suddenly became extremely alert, not aggressive, not frightened, just intensely focused. Her ears perked up. Her body became tense. She started pulling slightly against the leash. That immediately caught my attention. The odd thing was that Jubilee is usually the opposite. She's always been more of a barker than a puller. If something catches her attention, she normally vocalizes it. This time she remained silent. That somehow felt more unsettling. I assumed she had picked up the scent of an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe something moving through the brush. The forest is full of wildlife. As we continued walking, I noticed someone approaching us from the opposite direction. A woman. At first glance, there was nothing obviously wrong about her. She had large, messy hair and was carrying an orange safety vest tightly in one hand. The strange thing wasn't what she was wearing. People dress all kinds of ways around here. She honestly looked like she had stepped straight out of an early 1990s autumn clothing catalog. Her outfit wasn't unusual. What felt unusual was the way she looked at me. She stared, not casually. Not the way people normally glance at strangers on a trail. She stared continuously. As she approached, I gave a polite greeting. Hey, nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. She simply continued walking. The entire time, her eyes remained locked on me. She wore a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite look friendly. Her eyes seemed unusually wide. The expression felt wrong somehow. Not threatening exactly, just unsettling, as though she was studying me. The best way I can describe it is that she looked hungry, not physically hungry, just intensely focused. Like someone examining something they found interesting. I remembered the sign posted at the trail entrance. It warned visitors that hunting season ran from September through December and advised trail users to wear orange. I had always assumed the sign was meant for hunters. Suddenly, seeing the orange vest in her hand made me wonder if I had misunderstood. The encounter lasted only seconds. She passed by. I kept walking. Jubilee remained unusually alert. Neither of us looked back immediately. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, strange people exist everywhere. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe she simply didn't want to talk. But the uncomfortable feeling remained. As we neared the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming urge to turn around. I don't know why. It was almost instinctive. Just before exiting, I glanced back over my shoulder. For a split second, I thought I saw something. The woman and two men, standing farther back on the trail, watching us. The image lasted only a moment. Then it was gone. I immediately began questioning myself. Did I actually see them? Were they really there? Had I imagined it? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. But one thing kept bothering me. Jubilee's behavior. Dogs notice things, not supernatural things necessarily, just things humans sometimes miss. And she had definitely noticed something. By the time we reached home, I had mostly convinced myself I was being ridiculous. I spent the afternoon working around the house and trying not to think about it. Then something happened that brought all the discomfort rushing back. As evening approached, both dogs suddenly became fixated on the back door. Not just Jubilee. Pinball, too. That was unusual. Very unusual. Jubilee began staring toward the glass, then barking. Pinball joined in. Both dogs stood near the door, focused on something outside. Neither seemed interested in moving away. I checked the yard. Nothing. I checked again. Still nothing. Yet the barking continued. Now, do I genuinely believe anything paranormal was happening? No, not really. There are countless explanations. Maybe someone walked through the neighborhood. Maybe there was wildlife outside. Maybe the woman on the trail was completely harmless. Maybe the two men I thought I saw weren't even there. Maybe my brain connected unrelated events and created a story where none existed. All of those explanations are possible, and yet I can't completely ignore how strange the entire day felt. The empty trail. Jubilee's unusual behavior, the woman who never stopped staring, the glimpse of figures watching from behind, and finally, both dogs refusing to stop barking at the back door. Individually, none of those things are especially frightening. Together, though, they created a feeling I still can't quite explain. Tomorrow, I plan to go back to the trail. This time I'll bring both Jubilee and Pinball. Maybe everything will feel perfectly normal. Maybe I'll laugh at myself for being creeped out. Or maybe I'll finally figure out why that walk left me feeling like something wasn't quite right. Either way, I have a feeling I'll be paying a lot more attention to who's watching from the trees. This happened about 2 years ago, and even now, I still think about it from time to time. Looking back, I'm not sure whether everything that happened had a logical explanation, or whether the tragic events that occurred simply changed the way everyone in the neighborhood felt. Either way, The atmosphere of that place changed completely, and it never felt the same again. At the time, I lived in a residential neighborhood located near a wooded area. The neighborhood wasn't isolated, but it always had a slightly eerie feeling after dark. A railway line ran beside it, and throughout the day and night, trains would pass by. During daylight hours, the area felt normal enough, but once the sun went down, everything changed. The trees became dark silhouettes against the sky, the train tracks seemed to disappear into the darkness, and the entire neighborhood felt quieter than it should have. Even before anything happened, it could be a creepy place to walk around at night. Our housing society consisted of 2 main apartment buildings. The building where I lived was divided into 2 sections connected together. It was a fairly ordinary place where families lived, children played outside, and neighbors knew one another. Then, in June of 2023, something tragic happened. A young girl who lived in the section next to mine lost her life after struggling with the results of an important exam. I won't go into the details out of respect, but the news spread quickly throughout the entire neighborhood. Everyone was shocked. People talked about it for weeks. The atmosphere changed almost overnight. Even if you didn't know her personally, it was impossible not to feel the sadness hanging over the area. Whenever people passed by her apartment, they would lower their voices. Conversations became quieter. It felt as if a shadow had settled over the entire building. Not long after, strange stories started circulating. Some residents claimed they had seen the door of her apartment moving on its own. According to them, it would slowly open and close despite nobody being inside. Others said they felt uncomfortable whenever they walked past that part of the building. Of course, there were plenty of logical explanations. Old buildings make noises. Doors move because of airflow. People often become more sensitive after a tragedy. But regardless of the explanations, the neighborhood felt different. Even people who usually dismissed ghost stories admitted that something about the place seemed unsettling. Around that time, I would often take my dogs out for walks in the evening. One night, while walking through the neighborhood, I noticed something unusual. My dogs suddenly became nervous. Normally, they were confident and energetic, always eager to explore every corner of the area. That night, however, they acted differently. They started whining softly and staying unusually close to me. They kept looking around as if they were hearing or sensing something I couldn't. At first, I assumed they had noticed another animal. But their behavior continued throughout the walk. Then there were the stray dogs. Our neighborhood had several stray dogs that everyone knew. They were friendly, vaccinated, and generally harmless. For years, they behaved normally. After the incident, however, many residents began noticing that the dogs would howl during the middle of the night, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at 2 a.m, sometimes even later. The sound would echo through the neighborhood, especially on quiet nights. Hearing several dogs howling in the darkness while trains passed in the distance created an atmosphere that felt straight out of a horror movie. Still, those things alone weren't enough to convince me that anything supernatural was happening. Then, another tragedy struck. Later that same year, in November, one of my close friends lost his life after falling from the top of one of the buildings. There were many rumors afterward. Some people believed it was intentional. Others believed it was the result of one of the dangerous stunts he was known for. He had always been the type of person who pushed limits and took risks. No matter what the truth was, the result was the same. He was gone. The building itself had 7 floors, with a terrace on the roof. According to what people said, the fall happened from there. Losing someone I actually knew affected me far more deeply than the earlier incident. The entire neighborhood seemed to sink even further into sadness, and after that, the strange experiences didn't stop. A few days later, I was walking around at night. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take a walk through the area. The parking section of the building was located underneath part of the structure. Cars were parked there in rows, and at night, the lighting wasn't particularly good. Large sections of the parking area remained hidden in shadow. As I was walking past it, something caught my attention. Movement. At first, I thought it was another person. Then I realized whatever I had seen was moving unusually fast. I looked directly toward it. For only a brief moment, I saw what appeared to be a dark figure. Not a detailed person that I could identify. Just a black shape, a silhouette. It sprinted across the parking area and disappeared into the darkness between the parked vehicles. The entire thing lasted only a second or two. I immediately stopped walking. My heart started racing. I stared into the darkness, trying to see where it had gone. Nothing. The figure was gone. Part of me wanted to investigate. The smarter part of me decided otherwise. I turned around and left. As I walked home, I kept trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was another resident. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes had misinterpreted movement in the darkness. But the image stayed with me. It looked so strange, so unnatural. And combined with everything that had happened that year, it felt impossible to ignore. Eventually, I moved away from that neighborhood. Even before leaving, the place never felt quite right anymore. Maybe the tragedies had changed the way everyone saw the area. Maybe grief and fear caused people to notice things they would normally ignore. Or maybe there were events that none of us could fully explain. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that those experiences left a lasting impression on me. Whenever I think about that neighborhood, I don't just remember the creepy stories or the strange things people claim to see. I remember the people who were lost. I remember how quickly life can change. And I remember how important it is to take mental and emotional struggles seriously. If you're going through a difficult time, don't ignore it. Talk to someone you trust. Write your thoughts down. Reach out to friends or family. Find healthy ways to cope and stay connected. Life can be incredibly difficult at times, but nobody should have to carry those struggles alone. The strange experiences may be what people remember from this story, but the real lesson I took away from those years is that every person matters more than they realize. And sometimes a simple conversation can make a bigger difference than we ever know. I know this story isn't as terrifying as some of the others people share, but it's one of those experiences that has stuck with me for years because I still can't explain it. Even now, whenever Christmas comes around and I think back to it, I get chills. This happened when I was 11 years old. At the time, Christmas was only a few days away, and like most kids that age, I was incredibly excited. Our house was already decorated for the holidays. Lights hung around the rooms, Christmas music played throughout the day, and the large Christmas tree stood proudly in front of the biggest window in our family room. The tree was beautiful. It was covered in ornaments collected over the years, colorful lights and decorations that reflected off the window after dark. At night, when the rest of the room was dimly lit, the tree became the center of attention. The large window behind it looked out onto our front porch and yard. During the winter, everything outside was covered in snow. Normally, it was a peaceful view. That year, however, something strange kept happening. My cousin had actually experienced it before I did. The previous Christmas season, she had told family members about hearing footsteps outside the house. At the time, most people brushed it off as someone walking by, or maybe just an active imagination. But she insisted the sounds were real. She described hearing heavy footsteps crossing the porch directly in front of the large window where the Christmas tree stood. The way she talked about it made it sound deliberate. Not someone casually walking, not an animal moving around. Heavy footsteps, like someone stomping back and forth outside. When she told me about it, I wasn't sure what to think. Part of me believed her. Part of me assumed there was probably a simple explanation. Then, a few days before Christmas, I experienced it myself. That evening, my cousin and I were sitting together in the family room. The Christmas tree lights glowed softly beside us, casting colorful reflections across the room. Outside, it was completely dark. The snow covered everything, making the night feel even quieter. We were talking and hanging out when my cousin suddenly became alert. She looked toward the window. I immediately knew what she was thinking. Without saying much, we both listened. The house was silent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then we heard it. Stomp, stomp, stomp. The sound came from directly outside the large window. My entire body went still. The footsteps were loud, much louder than I expected. It sounded exactly like someone walking heavily across the porch. Not running, not sneaking, just slowly stomping along as if they wanted to be heard. My cousin immediately looked at me. I looked back at her. Neither of us said anything. We simply listened. The footsteps continued. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Each step seemed to move across the porch in front of the window. The strange thing was that we couldn't see anyone. If a person had been walking there, we should have been able to notice some kind of movement. A shadow, a silhouette, something, but there was nothing, just the sound. The noise lasted long enough that I finally decided I wanted to see who was out there. At 11 years old, curiosity often overpowered common sense. Instead of staying inside, I got up and headed toward the door located beside the large window. My cousin stayed behind. I remember feeling nervous as I approached the door. The footsteps had stopped by then. Everything outside had gone silent again. I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold winter air hit me immediately. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking around. Nothing. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. No people, no animals, no movement anywhere. At first, I thought whoever had been there must have walked away. Then I looked down. The entire ground was covered in snow. Fresh snow. The kind that clearly shows every footprint. There weren't any. Not one. No footprints leading to the porch. No footprints leaving it. No signs that anyone had been there at all. I checked the area carefully. The snow remained untouched. It looked exactly as it had before we heard the footsteps. I stood there for several moments trying to understand what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. The sounds had been unmistakable. Both my cousin and I heard them. They sounded exactly like someone walking across the porch. Yet there was absolutely no evidence that anyone had been there. Eventually, I went back inside. My cousin immediately asked what I had found. When I told her there was nothing outside, her face went pale. Because that was exactly what had happened to her the year before. After that night, the footsteps continued. Not every night, but often enough that we started expecting them. They always seemed to happen during the same time period, usually somewhere between 8 p.m. and midnight, and almost always in the days leading up to Christmas. The pattern itself made the whole thing feel even stranger. Every year when Christmas approached, we found ourselves listening for those sounds. Sometimes we'd hear them, sometimes we wouldn't. But whenever they came, they sounded exactly the same. Heavy footsteps crossing the porch in front of the Christmas tree. Slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. As the years passed, people offered different explanations. Some suggested it might have been ice shifting on the roof. Others thought it could have been sounds traveling strangely through the cold winter air. A few believed it was probably an animal moving around. Maybe any of those explanations could be true. But none of them ever fully explained why the sounds seemed so much like human footsteps, or why they occurred in front of the window, or why there were never any footprints left behind in the snow. Even now, years later, I still don't know what caused those sounds. Maybe there is a perfectly logical answer. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that when you're 11 years old, sitting beside a glowing Christmas tree on a dark winter night, hearing heavy footsteps outside your window while knowing nobody is there is one of the creepiest feelings imaginable. To this day, whenever I see a Christmas tree standing in front of a large window, part of me remembers those nights. The quiet house, the dark snowy yard, the colorful lights reflecting against the glass, and the sound of someone, or something, slowly stomping across the porch where no footprints could ever be found. I've told this story quite a few times over the years, but I don't think I've ever told it in a way that truly captures how terrifying it felt at the time. Looking back now, there isn't anything that clearly proves something supernatural happened. There are probably logical explanations for most of it. But whenever I think about that night, what stands out isn't the details, it's the fear. The overwhelming feeling that something was very wrong. I was around 11 years old when it happened. At the time, I attended a school that organized multi-day outdoor camps every year. Over the 3 years I spent there, I went on 3 different trips. This story comes from the second one. Unlike the previous camp, this location felt much more isolated. There were fewer buildings, more wilderness, and large stretches of forest surrounding the property. It was the kind of place that seemed fun and adventurous during the day, but looked completely different once the sun went down. From what I remember, it was a 2-day trip. The first day had gone well. Everyone was excited to be away from school, hanging out with friends, and enjoying the activities. That evening, the instructors organized a large scavenger hunt. The entire camp was divided into color teams. The 2 teams that matter in this story were the blue team, which was my team, and the yellow team, our biggest competition. Each team received a map and a list of clues that would eventually lead to a hidden prize. At first, everything was great. We spent hours running around the campgrounds, solving clues, searching for markers, and trying to stay ahead of the yellow team. The competition became surprisingly intense. Every time we thought we were ahead, we'd hear that yellow team had found another clue. Every time they gained ground, we'd find another location. By the evening, both teams were practically neck and neck. There was only one final location left. Whoever found it first would win the prize. By that point, the scavenger hunt had led us toward an area near the beach. It was around 8 o'clock in the evening, and daylight was beginning to fade. The atmosphere had already started changing. The excitement was still there, but darkness was slowly creeping into the woods. That's when things first went wrong. While searching for the final clue, our team came across another group of students. At first, we assumed they were just behind us in the scavenger hunt. Then we noticed the commotion. One of the girls had gotten injured. She was actually a friend of mine. The teachers had repeatedly warned everyone not to wear Crocs during outdoor activities because of the rough terrain. Unfortunately, she ignored the warning. While walking through the woods, she stepped on a sharp piece of wood that cut into her foot. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was painful. There was blood. She couldn't walk properly, and suddenly, the scavenger hunt became less important than helping her. Because of the injury, our group split up. Some students stayed behind with her until adults could help. Others continued searching for the final clue. A few students from another team joined our group as well. After all the reshuffling, there were only 5 of us left continuing the hunt. That's when 2 members of our group made the worst decision of the night. They became convinced they knew where the prize was hidden. The castle. Earlier that day, the camp guides had shown us a large wooden play structure they called the castle. It sat near the edge of the property and was designed for younger kids. For some reason, these 2 boys became absolutely convinced the final prize was hidden there. The problem? The map clearly showed otherwise. The final clue wasn't anywhere near the castle. The other 3 of us pointed this out repeatedly. They didn't care. Without warning, they took off running toward the castle. We shouted after them. We argued. We told them they were wrong. Nothing worked. Not wanting to split the group even further, we chased after them. For nearly 30 minutes. By the time we reached the castle, it was already getting late. And unsurprisingly, there was nothing there. No prize, no clue. Nothing. Just the castle itself. At that point, it was around 9 o'clock. Darkness had fully settled over the campgrounds. The 3 of us who had been right wanted to leave immediately. We assumed Yellow Team had probably already found the prize. The hunt was basically over. But somehow, those 2 boys still refused to admit they were wrong. They spent even more time searching around the castle, looking under things, checking random corners, insisting the prize had to be nearby. The frustration was unbelievable. Eventually, I snapped. I told them enough was enough. There was no prize. There was never a prize there. We needed to go back. Finally, they agreed, so the 5 of us began walking back toward camp. At least, we thought we were walking back toward camp. About 5 minutes later, we realized something. We were completely lost. The darkness was absolute. There were no lights, no visible landmarks. Nothing. The flashlights helped, but not much. Everything looked the same. Trees, bushes, darkness. The more we walked, the more obvious it became that nobody knew where we were. The temperature seemed to drop. The woods felt larger. The excitement from the scavenger hunt disappeared completely. Fear replaced it. I remember getting increasingly angry at the 2 boys who had led us there. I kept reminding them that the rest of us had warned them, that we'd wasted nearly an hour because of them, that we were now completely lost in the woods. Oddly enough, some of them still managed to laugh about it, at least at first. As time passed, the laughter stopped. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around us. Then we heard it. Whistling. At first it was faint, high-pitched. Not particularly loud, just enough to make us stop walking. We all heard it. Every single one of us. The sound seemed to drift through the woods. It wasn't a melody. It wasn't a song. Just a simple whistle. Again, and again, and again. I can't fully explain why it was so unsettling. Maybe because it sounded human. Maybe because we were lost. Maybe because there was nobody else supposed to be out there. Whatever the reason, the sound immediately raised everyone's anxiety. The whistling continued. Sometimes it seemed distant. Other times it sounded closer. None of us could figure out where it was coming from. The woods around us remained completely dark. At one point, we considered trying to locate the source. That idea lasted about 3 seconds. Instead, we picked a direction and started moving. Quickly, the longer we stayed there, the more uncomfortable we became. Eventually, moving turned into jogging. Jogging turned into running. We ran through the woods for what felt like forever, probably around 10 minutes. Then, finally, we found someone. one of the teachers. Relief hit us instantly. But that relief didn't last long, because we quickly learned something disturbing. We weren't the only ones who had gotten lost. Not even close. At least 4 separate groups of students had become separated from their teams that night. One girl from Yellow Team had somehow been left alone near the beach. When she was found, she reported hearing the same whistling. Another group of girls had become lost in a different section of the woods. According to them, they wandered for so long that they eventually stumbled across a cabin owned by someone who lived nearby. The cabin owner helped guide them back to camp. But the story that frightened everyone the most involved 2 girls. One of them was my injured friend. The same friend whose accident had caused our group to split up earlier. The other girl was someone she absolutely hated. And I mean hated. The 2 argued constantly. They couldn't stand each other. Nobody expected them to spend 5 minutes together voluntarily, let alone get lost together. Yet somehow, they ended up paired together that night. When they finally returned to camp, both were crying. Not upset, not emotional. Terrified. These were 2 tough kids. Neither of them cried easily. Seeing them like that immediately got everyone's attention. According to their story, they had become lost in the woods and ended up near a hill. While trying to find their way back, they noticed figures standing at the top. Dark figures. Several of them. The girls estimated the figures were around 70 feet away. The figures stood there silently, looking down at them. Then came the whistling, the same whistling everyone else had reported hearing. The girls claimed the figures began moving, then chasing them. Whether that's exactly what happened, nobody knows. Fear can distort memories. Darkness can play tricks on your eyes. But whatever they experienced was enough to leave them covered in scratches, crying uncontrollably, and desperate to get back to camp. When everyone was finally reunited, the mood was completely different from earlier. The excitement was gone. Many students were crying. Others sat silently. Even people who hadn't gotten lost looked shaken. The fear spread through the entire camp. Nobody slept particularly well that night. Looking back now, I still don't know what happened. Maybe the whistling had a perfectly normal source. Maybe the darkness caused people to imagine things. Maybe being lost in unfamiliar woods amplified every sound and every shadow. That's certainly possible. But the strange part is how many separate groups reported similar experiences. People who weren't together. People who had no opportunity to coordinate stories. Yet they all mentioned the same unsettling whistling, the same overwhelming feeling of fear. And then there was one final detail. Less than a month after our trip, the camp was temporarily shut down. An 8-year-old child died there in an unrelated incident. Learning that afterward only added another layer of unease to an experience that already felt surreal. Even now, years later, I still remember standing in those woods. The cold, the darkness, the feeling of being completely lost, and above all else, that strange whistling drifting through the trees where nobody seemed to be. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there wasn't, but I can still remember exactly how scared we were. And sometimes, fear itself is the part of the story that stays with you the longest. This happened a few years ago. And even though I've tried to come up with logical explanations for it, it's still one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had. Looking back, maybe I misunderstood some of what happened because I was tired. Maybe my mind filled in details. But at the time, it felt completely real, and I can still remember exactly how scared I was. It was late at night, probably around 1 in the morning. I should have been asleep, but I wasn't. I had been watching a movie or something similar and didn't feel tired enough to go to sleep. Everyone else in the house had already gone to bed. I shared a room with my two sisters. The room had 4 beds lined up along one wall. Because of how the beds were arranged, we couldn't really see each other while lying down, but we all slept in the same room. That night, I was the only one still awake. The room was completely dark, except for a tiny bit of light coming through the curtains. Everything was quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in the middle of the night when everyone else is asleep. I remember lying in bed listening to the silence. At some point, I heard a sound from another room. A door opening. Normally, that wouldn't have been strange. People get up during the night all the time. Maybe someone needs water. Maybe someone uses the bathroom. Maybe they can't sleep. My first thought was that one of my parents had gotten up. As soon as I heard the sound, I reacted instinctively. I pulled my blanket up over my face. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because I knew I should have been asleep. Maybe because I didn't want my parents to know I was still awake. Whatever the reason, I completely covered myself. The blanket was over my face, leaving only tiny gaps where I could breathe. I lay perfectly still, listening. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps. Someone had entered our room. The strange thing was that our floor normally wasn't very noisy. It creaked occasionally, but not much. That night, however, every step seemed louder than usual. Maybe it was because the house was so quiet. Maybe it was because I was focused on listening. Either way, I could hear the footsteps clearly, step, 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 slowly moving across the room, getting closer and closer. My heart immediately started racing. I remember thinking that I was definitely about to get caught. There was no way someone wouldn't notice I was awake. I was tense, trying not to move, trying not to breathe too loudly. The footsteps continued approaching until they seemed to stop right beside my bed. For a moment, everything became silent. Then, something happened that I still can't explain. I suddenly felt a huge weight beside me, not on top of me, not pressing directly against me, but on the mattress right next to my body. It felt exactly like someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. The pressure was immediate and obvious. The mattress shifted noticeably. In fact, it felt so heavy that I could feel my body rolling slightly toward that side. The sensation was incredibly realistic. I remember thinking it had to be my dad. That was the only explanation that made sense. But even then, something felt wrong. The weight felt heavier than I expected, much heavier. My dad wasn't particularly heavy, yet whoever, or whatever, was sitting there felt like they weighed far more than he did. I stayed completely still. I didn't dare move the blanket. I didn't dare open my eyes. I just waited. Then, I heard breathing. A single long breath. Deep, slow, I could clearly hear the inhale. Then, the exhale. The sound seemed incredibly close. Close enough that it felt like whoever was sitting beside me was leaning near my bed. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. At that moment, I wasn't even thinking clearly anymore. I was just focused on that breathing. The room felt smaller. The darkness felt heavier. The silence afterward felt endless. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the weight disappeared. The mattress slowly became lighter. The pressure lifted. I could feel my body settling back into place. Whoever had been sitting beside me had apparently stood up. I heard footsteps again, slowly moving away. Step, step, step toward the doorway. Then the footsteps stopped. A few seconds passed. I remained frozen beneath the blanket. Listening, waiting, nothing, no more sounds. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The blanket felt suffocating. I needed air. Slowly, I pulled it away from my face. I took a deep breath and looked around the room. Everything looked normal. The room was dark. My sisters were asleep. The large mirrored doors on our dresser reflected the darkness around us. There was nobody standing in the room. Nobody near my bed. Nobody by the door. Nothing. The room appeared completely empty. I sat there trying to process what had just happened. That's when I realized something strange. I had heard whoever entered the room. I had heard them walk toward me. I had heard them leave. But I had never heard another door open. And I had never heard another door close. If it had been one of my parents, they would have returned to their room afterward. Their bedroom door made noise when it opened and closed. I should have heard it. But I hadn't. Not a single sound. The footsteps simply ended. And that was it. I didn't sleep much after that. Every tiny noise in the house made me nervous. I kept replaying the experience in my head, trying to understand what had happened, trying to convince myself it was one of my parents, trying to find any explanation that made sense. The next morning, I immediately asked my dad about it. I described hearing someone enter my room late at night. I asked if he had checked on us. He looked confused. Then he told me no. He hadn't gotten up during the night, not even once. I asked about my mom. Same answer. She hadn't gotten up either. Neither of my sisters had left their beds. Everyone insisted they had slept through the entire night. That answer should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel worse. Because if it wasn't my dad, then who or what had been sitting beside me? To this day, I honestly don't know. Maybe I was half asleep and dreamed part of it. Maybe I experienced some strange sleep-related phenomenon. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation that I simply missed. But the thing that has always stayed with me is how real it felt. The footsteps felt real. The breathing felt real. And most of all, that weight on the mattress felt real. I can still remember the sensation of the bed sinking beside me as if someone was sitting there. Years have passed since then. But whenever I think about that night, I get the same uncomfortable feeling I had back then. Because whether it was my imagination or something else entirely, I was absolutely convinced that someone sat beside me in the darkness. And for a few terrifying moments, I was too scared to look and see who it was. No worries about being late, and don't worry about your spelling either. I've had a lot of strange experiences throughout my life, but the ones that happened in the trailer where I grew up are the ones I remember most clearly. At the time, I was around 10 or 11 years old. My family lived in a trailer. It wasn't huge, but it was big enough for the 5 of us living there. From the outside, it looked completely normal. It wasn't abandoned, run down, or anything that would immediately seem creepy. But for as long as I can remember, strange things happened inside that place. At first, it was little things. Odd noises. The feeling that someone was watching me. Random sounds that never seemed to have a source. Like most kids, I tried to ignore them. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then things started happening that were much harder to explain. One night I was asleep in my bed. I remember lying on my side with my back facing the wall. Everything seemed normal. Then I suddenly woke up. At first I wasn't sure why. I was still half asleep, trying to understand what had disturbed me. Then I felt it. Breathing, right behind me, close enough that I could feel it against my neck. It felt exactly like someone was standing over my bed, leaning down toward me. I froze immediately. Every muscle in my body locked up. I didn't move. I didn't turn around. I just lay there listening. The breathing felt so real. Slow, steady, close, far too close. I kept telling myself it had to be one of my family members. Maybe someone had come into my room. Maybe I was imagining things because I had just woken up. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. Eventually, the feeling disappeared. I don't remember exactly how long it lasted. I only remember being terrified. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, the same thing continued happening. Sometimes I would wake up and feel as though someone was standing near my bed. Other times I would hear breathing when nobody was there. And then the voices started. At first, they were faint, almost impossible to understand. But over time, they became clearer. The strange thing was that the voices sounded familiar. Sometimes they sounded like members of my family. Other times they sounded like a mixture of different voices all blended together. I could never make out exactly what they were saying. I only knew that I was hearing them. This continued for years. Not every day. Not every night. But often enough that I became used to it. As weird as that sounds, after a while it became part of life. The fear never completely disappeared, but I learned to live with it. Then one night, I had an experience that terrified me more than anything before. I had fallen asleep and started having a nightmare. The dream involved a school lockdown. Looking back, it sounds childish, but at the time it felt incredibly real. In the dream, everyone was hiding and trying to stay quiet. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was afraid. Then suddenly I heard a voice. A whisper, right next to my ear. Not somewhere in the dream, not in the distance, directly beside me. The voice said, "It is real." I remember those exact words because of how frightening they felt. The whisper sounded completely real. So real that I instantly woke up. I sat upright in bed. My heart was racing. The room was dark. For a few seconds, I just stared ahead, trying to calm myself down. Then I looked toward the doorway, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Standing in the doorway, watching me. The shape was enormous, far taller than anyone in my family. I couldn't make out details because of the darkness. All I could see was the outline. A huge silhouette standing completely still, looking directly at me. For a second, I thought it might be my mom, or my stepdad, maybe someone checking on me. I turned away briefly, expecting to see one of them nearby. Then I looked back toward the doorway. The figure was gone. Completely gone. The doorway was empty. Nothing stood there. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I sat awake for a long time after that, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, trying to find some explanation. But the image stayed with me, and even now, years later, I can still picture it. The strangest part is that I wasn't the only one experiencing things. My sister had her own experiences in that trailer. According to her, she would sometimes see a strange green figure inside our room. She described it as a green entity that would run toward her as if trying to touch her. Whenever it got close, it would suddenly stop and run away into the hallway. Then, it would return. Back and forth, over and over again. She said it happened multiple times. The figure would enter the room, rush toward her, retreat into the hallway, and then come back again. Naturally, I thought she was joking at first. But the fear in her voice whenever she talked about it made me believe she genuinely experienced something. Whatever was happening, it wasn't affecting only me. The experiences continued until we eventually moved to a different trailer. But before we left, one final event happened that affected my stepdad. I call him my dad because that's how I've always viewed him. One evening, my parents got into a serious argument. The situation became tense enough that my siblings and I left the house with my mom and stayed at a hotel for the night. My dad remained behind at the trailer. At the time, we didn't think much of it. We assumed he simply wanted some time alone. Later, however, we learned something strange had happened. In the room where my sister and I often experienced unusual things, there was a closet that always made us uncomfortable. My dad apparently heard movement coming from inside it. At first, he thought there might be an animal trapped in there. Wanting to investigate, he walked over and pressed his ear against the closet door. He listened carefully, and according to him, he definitely heard something moving inside. Then something happened that terrified him. The closet door suddenly slammed outward, hard, as though something had kicked it from the inside. When my dad arrived at the hotel later that night, he looked completely shaken. I had never seen him like that before. He wasn't the type of person who scared easily. He wasn't someone who believed in ghosts or supernatural stories. Yet that night, he looked genuinely frightened. His hands were trembling. His face was pale. And although he wouldn't tell us exactly what had happened, he quietly spoke to my mom about it. After that night, his behavior changed. He started checking on us during the night more often. He became much more protective whenever we talked about hearing or seeing strange things. The biggest change, however, involved religion. My dad had never been particularly religious. He wasn't someone who talked about faith often. He didn't normally keep religious items around the house. Yet after that experience, he placed a cross in our room. He also brought in a candle dedicated to St. Jude and placed a Bible nearby. He said it was to protect us, to keep away whatever might be bothering us. He even started making red bracelets for us to wear. According to him, they would help ward off negative spirits or bad energy. Whether they actually did anything, I don't know. What I do know is that he believed enough to try, and that alone scared me. Because if someone as skeptical as my dad was willing to do all of that, then whatever happened in that trailer must have frightened him far more than he ever admitted. Eventually, we moved away, and strangely enough, most of the experiences stopped. The breathing behind my neck, the voices, the figures, the strange feelings. They gradually disappeared. Maybe there were logical explanations for everything. Maybe being young made us imagine things. Maybe the trailer itself created noises that our minds interpreted as something else. I honestly don't know. But whenever my family gets together and talks about that old trailer, the stories always come back. And no matter how many years pass, none of us can fully explain what happened inside that place.